Hello, I'm Mario Toneguzzi, and I'm taking care of business. Joining me today is Franco Terrazzano, who is Federal Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Thanks, Franco, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on, Mario.
Well, I'm going to say that you're going to get into a little bit of hot water and heat over this, but let's talk about lockdown subsidies. And I know it's something that's been in the public eye basically for 2 years now, close to 2 years because of the pandemic. I want to get your thoughts on the notion of subsidies. And what I see today, you put out a report, $511 billion from the feds in the past 2 years. You don't think this is right, obviously.
Well, we all know that the federal government has been spending an unprecedented amount, more than $500 billion spent just on pandemic subsidies since 2020, from the beginning of the pandemic. Now, more than 80% of all of the lockdown subsidies that have gone to help businesses and workers stay afloat during provincial lockdowns have come from Ottawa. We now know that the federal government debt is past $1 trillion. The entire pre-pandemic debt will increase by nearly 90% by 2027. And we heard from the parliamentary budget officer that the federal government won't balance its budget under the status quo until 2070. So possibly 5 decades of deficits if the federal government doesn't change course. So what we're saying is that taxpayers can't afford this to become the new normal. We're all dealing now with rising surge in prices. And a large reason for that is because of all this government debt, because you have the central bank printing up new dollars, purchasing a significant amount of debt from Ottawa.
So yeah, you mentioned the $1 trillion mark. What does that mean? What does it mean, for a country to be in such overwhelming debt? What are the consequences of that?
Well, let me break it down, right? Because at the end of the day, that money has to come from taxpayers, whether it's through higher taxes today, higher taxes plus interest tomorrow, or through the inflation tax, which we're all feeling. So we're more than $1 trillion in debt federally. That comes down to more than $30,000 per Canadian. And I think what a lot of people are worried about is well, how are we going to pay for this unprecedented amount of government spending? But B, what type of nation and finances do we want to leave to future generations? Now, Mario, I mentioned, right, that we might not see a balanced budget until 2070. Well, if that were to happen, per person debt in Canada would reach $67,000 per Canadian. So that would be a whopping bill that we would be leaving to Canadians' kids and grandkids to pay back.
So, when you look at across the country and on the lockdown subsidies, it's obvious that the amount of money is mostly going to a couple of provinces, right? Quebec and Ontario, right? Because they have probably been the strictest in terms of having public health measures out there and lockdowns, and also per capita basis, most populous provinces. What does that mean to have, the majority of that money going to the 2 provinces? And I don't know, what are your thoughts?
Well, it raises a fairness issue. And this is an issue that I know you know all too well, being in Alberta, people on the prairies, but it does raise a fairness issue because these type of lockdown subsidies favor the provinces that have the strictest types of lockdowns, right? And then taxpayers in other provinces are left footing the bill. And one of the first rules of government is that when governments subsidize something, you can expect more of it. And because the bulk of the tab for these subsidies is coming from Ottawa, they're essentially subsidizing provincial lockdowns. So it's no surprise that provincial premiers, because they're not paying the full cost of their decisions, of their lockdowns, that they would be biased towards more lockdown. So essentially what we're saying, hey, we're almost 2 full years into the pandemic. The debt has already passed $1 trillion. Taxpayers can't afford for this type of spending to go on and on and on. We're saying it's time for the federal government to stop subsidizing provincial lockdowns.
So basically, here's the question, right? And here's the question that everybody asks. A lot of small business groups across the country, like the fact
Yeah.
that these subsidies are in place, because if the subsidies were not in place, a lot of these businesses would just be gone, right? A lot of jobs gone. What do you say to those people who say, well, these subsidies are helping businesses survive, stay in the business. It's not their fault that they've been locked down. So they've been penalized by governments for being locked down. So therefore, subsidies should be in place. What do you say to that argument?
I feel for them. I've heard so many horror stories, even from some of my own friends who started a business, who are worried about their own financial futures. And you're right, it's not their fault. They've done everything right. They saved for years. They built a business. They put their neighbors to work. It is not their fault, and I absolutely fear for them. But what we're saying now is that we have been in this pandemic for nearly 2 full years. So if provincial premiers, if they think it is best to have these types of lockdowns, they should now be required to foot the bill, not Ottawa, not the federal government, not taxpayers in other provinces. But if provincial premiers truly think that these type of restrictions are the best way forward, they should be required to foot the tab. And Mario, what that would do is it would actually force these premiers to redirect wasteful spending. Because what these lockdown subsidies from Ottawa are doing is that they're allowing these premiers to continue on with all of the other type of wasteful spending in their budget, because they don't have to pay the full cost of their lockdowns. So what we're saying is Ottawa should not be footing the bill anymore. They shouldn't be subsidizing provincial lockdowns. If premiers think this is the best measure, then they should be required to foot the bills, and they should be required to cut the other types of wasteful spending.
I guess it comes down to obviously as well the fact that how many times are we going to go through lockdowns, right? I know Ontario just announced yesterday, I think it was, the easing of some of their tough measures that they introduced a couple of weeks ago. But what happens in the next variant? It comes along. Are we kind of like in the lockdown mentality now forever, whenever we're hit by these kinds of pandemics or viruses?
Yeah, that's a good question. It raises a whole bunch of questions. And I know that uncertainty is also on the mind of many small business owners that we're just talking about. And it brings us back to the top point, right? When a government subsidizes something, expect more of it. With the federal government picking up the bulk of the tab for these premiers' decisions, you can expect that these premiers would be more biased towards these types of lockdowns, these types of restrictions. Now, you mentioned Ontario. Well, let's talk about what happened. Near the end of December, you had Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announce that he would be expanding pandemic subsidies for the workers and businesses who were impacted by provincial lockdowns. Now, about 2 weeks after that, what did Premier Doug Ford do? He announced these very strict restrictions, this new round of lockdowns. Well, Premier Ford didn't have to think about the full cost of his new lockdowns because Ottawa already had its credit card on the table.
Yeah, exactly. Well, interesting times, Franco. Thanks very much for joining us again today.
Hey, it was my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
All right, that's Franco Terrazzano, who is Federal Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. I'm Mario Toneguzzi. This has been Taking Care of Business. Thanks for joining us today.